and answers. Also, just want to take a second to thank everyone working behind the scene. That's Sandy Hart, Brianna Lathorpe, Susan DeGaya, and Betsy Spano. Without any further ado, let me introduce you to today's guests, the Interfaith Amigos, Imam Jamal Rahman, Pastor Don McKenzie, and Rabbi Ted Falcon. And I think I'm really going to turn this over to them and let them best introduce themselves. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
So would you like to...
Shall we do it all at the same time?
Whatever you all are comfortable with.
We usually start with the oldest tradition, Judaism. So Rabbi Ted can go on.
I am a Reform rabbi, actually celebrating this year the 50th year of being a Reform rabbi. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology. My focus is on the spiritual and universal aspects of Jewish tradition. I've been working with the Interfaith Amigos for the past, for a little over 16 years. And I began synagogues focusing on meditative traditions of Judaism in Los Angeles and in Seattle. And here I am.
Awesome. Thank you.
Here you are. I'm Pastor Don McKenzie. I'm a minister of the United Church of Christ, a Protestant tradition of Congregationalism. My life has been mainly in pastoral leadership in churches, but I too have been working with Rabbi Ted and Imam Jamal since 2001. And it's been my privilege to do that. I feel I have grown spiritually and theologically enormously because of my association with these two men. And we are very dear friends. After all this time, we'd have to be to stay together. And by the way,
put up with each other.
The guy with the kippah, I've never seen him before in my life. My specialty, I have a PhD in religion and art, and which is absolutely useless. I did teach a little bit in some seminaries, but my other interest, apart from spirituality and interfaith dialogue, is music. And I've played in a country band in Nashville, and find that there is a great relationship between the oneness that singing and playing music together incarnates and the work that we're doing. So glad to be here. Over to you, Imam Jamal.
Thank you, brother. My name is Jamal Rahman. I am Imam at the Interfaith Community Sanctuary. This is a church building we own, the oldest functioning church building in Seattle. It's a very unique place where we foster a living, breathing interfaith community. I'm also adjunct faculty at Seattle University, and I am 1/3 of the Interfaith Amigos. And we have been friends ever since, I like to say, my hair was black. And we really believe that the best way to overcome polarization is to come to know the other on a human level. So I am very grateful for our circle of love and delighted to be here. Thank you.
Oh, fabulous. That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, I'm super happy that you all are here. And before we get into the real sort of depth of today's topic, which is owning and having compassion for our shadow side, particularly at this time of year as we move into the winter solstice, is just to, as we spoke about in advance of this call, we at the Charter for Compassion are trying to support the Sustainable Development Goals. And so if we can just take a couple of seconds and talk about how some of the work that you are doing touches on these goals. Hold on. And they're now up on the screen. Anybody want to jump in? Any thoughts initially?
I think what interests us looking at these sustainability focuses is how much of them agree with the kind of work that we've been doing over, well, I would say over these years, but also over our entire lives as teachers and as students.
Mm-hmm.
we are involved in our individual communities as well as our work together. I would say that behind all of these is a state of consciousness that is well summed up in the work of Charter for Compassion. You know, an awareness of the connection between people and planet, between people and universe, each of which is really reflected in the focuses in the sustainability development goals. I would say that we focus most on peace, justice, and strong institutions, you know, institutions that are able to, in one way or another, examine themselves to see whether they are maintaining their original focus or whether they have become mired in the particular needs of the institution rather than in the purposes for which they had been formed. And certainly a focus on gender equality and education. I don't think it would be helpful to go through each and every one of these, except to say that we promote and support and explore a consciousness that supports each and every one of them.
I would say none of this is possible without really cultivating compassion for self and for others. And, you know, I would like to use the metaphor which all the sages use to explain the power and the majesty and the beauty of compassion, this divine attribute. For example, there is this insight that there is nothing as soft and yielding as water is, yet for overcoming the hardest, there's nothing as powerful as water is, meaning the person who is gentle and compassionate is possessed of authentic raw strength. Then, as the Holy Book suggests, the Quran suggests also that wherever water falls, life flourishes. So compassion is also life-giving and life-bestowing. So really the understanding of and the cultivation of mercy and gentleness for oneself and for others is the key.
I remember when we got started after 9/11 and started meeting weekly, we brought, I think, each of us an intuition that if we could penetrate the barriers that have historically separated our traditions, we might be able to find a way to cooperate in addressing the great moral issues that the world is facing. And I remember among those issues were the problem of violence being used to solve problems, the need to sustain the environment, and full access to all human and civil rights for everyone. And as I look at these things, the 17, I think that just about covers it. Yeah. And so we're right where you are.
So I think it was something that came up that Sandy came up with in one of our earlier reaction to response calls was we really need an 18th goal, self-awareness and personal agency. And the three of you actually just kind of touched on that, but is there anything that you would like to sort of comment on or reflect on related to this?
You know, as my brothers always say, there's that cliche, we cannot solve a problem at the level of the problem. We have to rise above that. We simply have no choice, no matter what our traditions are, to really raise our consciousness, to really connect with the divine spark which exists within each one of us. So all the religions say, you know, we have a personality, which is nothing more than a bundle of conditioned reactions, but we are more than that. We're also Christ nature, Buddha nature, Allah nature, Elohim nature, Krishna nature. So our work is really to awaken to the higher self, the divine spark within us, so that any actions flowing from us reflects, that right action reflects our higher consciousness, our higher awareness.
Well said, brother.
Yeah, well said.
I think you pretty much just summed it up right then and there. Pastor John and Rabbi, anything you want to add to that, or the well said is the?
You know, it's like answering questions after our presentations. sometimes all of us answer the same question, and sometimes one of us gives an answer which is so inclusive that we say amen.
Very
You
good.
know, the whole notion of exploring the nature of consciousness, you know, which is really my central focus, has to do with exactly what Imam Jamal referenced, you know, understanding the wonderful nature of our separate self, of our personality, of our ego, but also appreciating that that's not all of who we are. We have a body, but we're not limited by our body. We have a mind, but we're more than our mind. And the exploration of that more allows us to attain a level of interconnectedness, a level of belonging, a level of love that is simply not available without that exploration of the nature of our own awareness. And from that awareness comes, you know, it's where the golden rule gets translated to the golden reality. Because on the level of the ego, it's a rule, it's something we should do. On the level of a more inclusive consciousness, it's the level of what we naturally do. Because we understand that to cause harm to any other being causes harm to all other beings. And to support another being supports us and supports all beings. And when we rise to that level of inclusive consciousness, that kind of behavior in the world, that kind of concern for others and for our planet and for ourselves is simply natural. It's just part of who we are. And we're no longer obeying rules. We are functioning as whole human persons.
Again, you know, I think I would almost say amen. That's very well said. I did think of one thing, though, as a kind of a footnote to what my colleagues have said in terms of self-awareness, which is the need to seek a balance within each of us of a feminine and masculine way of understanding experience. And it's the fact that we don't have that balance, which supports the patriarchy that is a good part of the resource of pain right now in the world. And I say that, of course, aware that this is a group that's concerned about the rights and lives of women and girls. And I think we understand this at some level because we're all men. And so the need to keep an awareness of this visible and so forth is quite great. In fact, we say sometimes that if we had known back in 2001 that we were going to have any public visibility, one of us would be a woman, and it would probably be me, because there are more women available in my tradition than any other. But I'm glad to be here, and we do take it as a sacred duty to just to try to seek this balance, which is part of a piece of what my colleagues have just described.
You know, there's another point that three of us always emphasize, the fact that we desperately need an authentic global community, because our problems, whether social justice issues or earth care, are so huge, so big, that no one religion, no one culture, no one gender can take care of it. We all have no choice but to get together and create global community. As Rumi says, can you come out of the circle of time and enter the circle of love?
That's beautiful. So you mentioned, Rabbi Don, hold on, before I go into this, there's a question here. The work the three of you are doing is quite remarkable. This is from Brianna Thorpe. And she says, I just attended a conference featuring many interfaith partners. One comment that several individuals made regarding interfaith work is often done when interfaith partners who are already in agreement. Have you three made efforts to engage this level of inclusive consciousness with members of the religious family who are not as open to this kind of interfaith work? That's a good question.
I thought the question was going to be slightly different, so I'm going to answer the question I thought it was going to be first. I thought it was going to be how come, we don't include other traditions in our interfaith work. The answer to which is twofold. One is there are many programs we do with leaders of Buddhist, Hindu, and other traditions. But the real problems in our part of the world are between and among the three Abrahamic religions, and we feel that in focusing on the Abrahamic traditions, we get to speak directly to those issues. We notice that people who disagree with us rarely come to our presentations. Sometimes they come and they lie in wait for the Q&A session so that they can inform us quite directly about the truth that we've been missing. What we say to them then, first of all, we thank them for coming because we know that they knew in advance that they were likely to hear things they didn't agree with. Mm-hmm. And then we would say, is there anything that we could tell you that would change your mind? Mm-hmm. No, really, is there anything that we could tell you that would lead you to change your mind? And they're likely to say no. And we would say, well, imagine that's the same for us. Now let's talk. Wow. Because as long as our conversation is really bracketed by the desire to change the mind of the other, we can have no effective dialogue. That said, the three of us in various ways, both individually and together, have made forays into communities and spoken with religious leaders that do disagree with our positions. And with rather interesting results. Imam Jamal can talk about one in specific that the two of us went to that kind of was surprising.
Yes. Well, shall I go on, Brother Ted?
Yes, that was like a cue. That was like...
I want to emphasize a point that you always, and Brother Don always emphasize, that our goal is not to change the other person's views, whether it's political or religious and cultural. Our goal is to connect on a human level, just as the three of us have connected. Can we share, we say, 3 cups of tea? Listen, respect, connect. And we like to share stories, human stories. The wonderful saying, the universe is not made out of atoms, it's made out of stories. So can we bond as human beings? And that's the best way to overcome demonization and polarization. The incident Brother Ted is referring to is we went to a mega church, very conservative, Christian, evangelical, extremely conservative. And the pastor was saying that, in the speech that, if somebody has AIDS, don't criticize them, be of help, be like Jesus. If a teenager is unmarried, has a baby, has a child, don't criticize her, be like Jesus. And Ted, he nudged me and said, wow, this is so beautiful. This is kind of disappointing. And then almost on cue, the pastor said, but if you want to be filled with hate and anger, be a Muslim, be a Muslim. Wow. So when we met him, I told him that, Pastor, Jesus, peace be upon him, is a prophet, loved in Islam. He would never say this. So he ignored me the first time. I told him a second time. Then he said, don't worry. He said, next time I'll pick on somebody else. Anyway, so our conversations continued, but the upshot of that was we agreed to get together and dialogue and connect as human beings. And the result was we collaborated, all of us, the Interfaith Amigos and his group and others, in Habitat for Humanity, building homes for the poor. And in this particular case, it was a home for a Muslim family. And he had no problem with that. He was delighted to do that. So really the key is connecting with the other on a human level.
But one of the things we would like to do more is to have the opportunity to have conversations with people who are within our own traditions with whom we disagree. To do exactly what Rabbi Ted and Imam Jamal have described, which is to listen and create an opportunity where the person speaking feels heard, and then let's talk, you know. And I think, I mean, we all see things a little differently, and we've had a couple of conversations with evangelical pastors, which have been instructive, I would say. I was invited to be on a talk radio show several years ago, and about 10 minutes into the show, it was clear that the host had no interest in what I thought. He wanted to show his audience that I was wrong. And so I told him, I said, you know, this is not good. I mean, you owe me an apology. You don't care what I think. You just want your people to understand that I'm wrong. And there was more than the 7-second radio silence there for a minute. And he mumbled something and so forth. And that was pretty much the end of the show. I mean, it was really too bad. But I could have, I mean, I suppose the option would have been for me to get angry and say, look, this is ridiculous. But I was just naming a truth. I said, you don't care what I think. You just want your people to know that I'm wrong. And I'm not sure if I would do the same thing again. I wish I could do it more in keeping with what Rabbi Ted and Imam Jamal have discussed. I mean, there's no point in making more enemies or making our enemies, you know, being more outspoken against their enemies and increasing the level of polarization. What we want to do is have conversation. We want to listen. We want to understand other points of view. And we want to be clear about what our goals are, namely cooperation on moral issues and the movement toward healing and a higher level of spiritual consciousness and self-awareness and a deeper sense of community and so forth. But it's really hard to get into those moments, and we wish we could find more ways to do it.
You know, and there's a key point to this, very critical point. When there is a human connection with somebody who is adversarial, even if there are outstanding differences, but now the difference no longer looms as a threat. And that is the key. And the second key point is, because there's a human connection, we can now focus on issues which are dear to all of our hearts, social justice issues, and even earth care. That's a huge difference when you connect on a human level.
I'm just sitting with that for a bit. So, hold on, there's another question here, which is going to kind of take us, off track, but I'm going to give the question, and then I'm going to circle back to continuing the conversation around the women and girls, divine masculine and feminine, and gender equality. The question is regarding your constellation. And the question is that if you have not, if you recognize that you don't have a feminine voice in your conversation, why have you not included a feminine voice in your conversation and expanded from a trio to a quad group?
And which religion would the woman be?
Well, yeah. Well, so that was my first thought based on some of what you had said. But then I thought, well, what if you had one of each and it was a sextet?
Right. We'd never be able to be invited anywhere. You know, even to have 3 is hard for people to invite for a program, you know, because of the plane tickets, because of the hotel reservation, you know, just what we have tried to discover, and we've found some, are trios of women, you know, who are amigas, interfaith amigas, you know, who are involved in similar work with whom we could do programs, you know, so that we could go to each other's territory and engage in that way. But we've resisted expanding our own group.
And we've always said, the 3 of us have always said that for us to be successful, it's a very poor situation if we are the only ones, the 3 Interfaith Amigos, doing this work. What we would really like is the proliferation of many more amigos and amigas. Daughters of Abraham, or people from different religions getting together. There are a number of them all over the United States, women getting together, women and men, interfaith amigos and amigas, and to be seen, to be going to different houses of worship, to be seen doing wonderful personal things together, so that they're an inspiration that gives hope and vision to others, people of different religions getting together, amigos and amigas.
Mm-hmm. And so, go ahead, please.
Just real quick, there was a group of 3 women in New York, probably 15 years ago, who wrote a book called The Faith Club. And their children were all in the same daycare, and they realized that they had an opportunity. One was a Jew, one was a Muslim, one was a Christian. They had an opportunity to learn from each other. And so they started meeting. And after some period of time, they wrote a book about their experience. And I mean, it was stunning that they did it, number one. Number two, they're not religious leaders. And they took this upon themselves. And the book is really good, The Faith Club. I don't know if they ever did presentations. I haven't heard anything about them since, but it was a pioneering effort that has been an inspiration for us.
Wow, that's really cool. So since we were going into the role of feminine and women and the work they do, what do each of your faiths say about the engagement of women in the social world and around women and girls? Can we talk a little bit more about that?
I think each of us comes from a faith that for centuries has been very patriarchal, and we need to recognize that. When I was in rabbinical school, I was one of the last classes that was all male. The first woman rabbi in the United States was ordained in 1972 at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, which was where I went. She was an undergraduate at the time I was there. And now there are many, many women rabbis, and the landscape has changed a good deal. There have been women who have been presidents of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the largest group of rabbis in the United States and internationally. There are women rabbis in all branches of Judaism, with the exception of Orthodox. But even in Orthodoxy, the role of women has been expanding. The education of women has been expanding, beyond the traditional role as keeper of the house and raiser of the children. It's far deeper and far more involved than that. I think in my tradition, which is largely motivated by the prophetic vision, we do our best to stay at the forefront of the support for greater equality. We recognize when we talk about where we feel our religions have gone astray, among the 4 major categories that we discuss in our second book, called Religion Gone Astray, is the inequality of men and women. And we feel addressing that inequality is a major thrust of each of our traditions in our day. And while we see great progress, we are also aware that there is much more to be done.
Don, do you want to go ahead, or should I go next? Go ahead.
I think Ted has said it well. I think there's some question about whether Jesus was a feminist, and I really can't answer that question. But I do feel the text suggests that he treated women with a value that was, prior to that, pretty much unknown. He treated them as full human beings. And even though there were 12 men who were the disciples, of course, that's a report that was written down by men. So we don't really fully know, even though there are some suggestions about the role of Mary Magdalene and some of the other women. And of course, in the story of the resurrection, it was a woman. It was a woman who recognized Jesus in the garden. And, to me, and one way of interpreting that is to say it takes a feminine sensibility to see this. And so it just shows how bereft men are without that. And I think there are many things in the life of Jesus that suggest his concern for the whole humanity of women, for the equality. I mean, he was still living in a time of such intense patriarchy. We are too, really. But and the stories were written down largely by men. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, we don't know exactly what was going on. But there was something happening that was pointing toward an equality that Rabbi Ted just mentioned.
As far as Islam is concerned, we have to acknowledge that patriarchy is a huge problem. It's a complicated issue. It varies in which country, which culture you come from. For example, in Saudi Arabia, women are just hopefully in summer beginning to drive. Mm-hmm. I'm from Bangladesh, the third or fourth largest Muslim country. For 25 years, we've had women who have been prime ministers. When a leader loses the election, the leader of the opposition happens to be a woman also. But we have to acknowledge that overall, at best, women in Islamic societies are second-class citizens. Mm-hmm. And this is very ironic because in the 7th century, it was unthinkable then and even now, the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gave women property rights, divorce rights, inheritance rights. Mm-hmm. The question is, what happened? Well, it seems like that was so revolutionary for that time that the men of the Arabian Peninsula, 7th century, went along as long as the Prophet was alive. But the moment he died and Islam spread to feudal societies, all those verses in the Quran in favor of women were, because of patriarchal bias, turned to be in favor of men, which is why women say the Quran is never the problem. The Prophet Muhammad, who was a radical feminist, is of course never the problem. The problem is the patriarchy of men. Mm-hmm. They say there's no such thing as the Quran says this or the Quran says that. The question is, who says the Quran says this? 100% men. But I want to end with the good news that there is a movement, a global movement called Women on the Move. Mm. Islamic women are realizing the best way to empower themselves is to fight for rights of education. So for example, in a conservative country like Saudi Arabia, 60% of university enrollees are women. 40% of doctors are women. 40% of private wealth is in the hands of women. In Iran, again considered a very conservative Islamic society, there are more women with PhDs and men with PhDs. So a lot of fermentation, change, movements is going on underneath at the grassroots level in Muslim societies. And I would say women's liberation will come from those Islamic feminist movements, inshallah.
Inshallah. Yeah. Do you feel that, how do I ask this question? Earlier, Pastor John, you made reference to the divine masculine and the divine feminine. And so I'm just wondering, in the spiritual texts, is there, how do you define or discern the difference between the feminine qualities and masculine qualities of God, and then how that interplays? I guess what I'm looking at is I'm sort of trying to tie this whole idea together of the masculine and feminine qualities, which we all have, how it ties into the consciousness of each of the Abrahamic religions through action. That's kind of a clunky question. Should I refine that a little bit, or do you have a bit of an essence?
We'd be glad to give a clunky answer.
Yeah, clunky, good, great.
Yeah. In Jewish tradition, in terms of the masculine and feminine aspect of God, that's spelled out very specifically. Mm-hmm. The masculine aspect gets called HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed is He, which is like the absolute transcendent aspect of the One. And the feminine aspect is called Shekhinah, which is literally the indwelling presence. And in some ways, we human beings represent within us, we are the Shekhinah, we are the indwelling presence. That transcendent One awakens within each individual being as Shekhinah, the one who dwells within us. The Shabbat, particularly in the more spiritual traditions of Judaism, is seen as the union, the moment of the wedding of the masculine and the feminine, bringing the universe into a kind of balance, which is symbolized as the completion of creation, which is celebrated as the Sabbath, as Shabbat. One of the interesting things about both the Hebrew language and the Arabic language is that we don't have a neuter. There's no way of saying it. That comes along with Greek, and then that infects the English language. If you can't say it, then everything is either masculine or feminine. That means objects are either masculine or feminine. And that is an interesting linguistic foundation for a kind of recognition of the balance between the masculine and the feminine energies. Whether that linguistic basis, the heart, is recognized and acted upon through the centuries and even in our own day is another question. But the basis is rather remarkable. We can't get away from gender energetic references within the very language. And that would be the language not only of the marketplace, but that's the language of prayer, and that's the language of Torah, and the language of the scripture, the Bible.
But Don, you want to go ahead?
Just to mention that one of the places where, one of the aspects of being where we find that we find lacking in unrestrained masculinity is vulnerability, which is a term that's kind of hard to define, but it suggests a willingness to be open to the pluses and minuses of our own beings, as well as the aspects of the lives of other people. And I think, in fact, we discovered, the three of us, each of us discovered that in order for us to enter into an effective dialogue, we had to become more vulnerable. We had to exercise a kind of vulnerability that, instead of defending the faith, be more willing to listen and even be critical of our own experience as well as other things. And I was talking with someone about this the other day, and I brought up an example that may seem silly, but in some country music, there's a combination of these two things. I mean, the cowboy image is the experience of the tough guy. In fact, the tough guy who is not vulnerable on the one hand, but to sing requires vulnerability. You can't open your mouth and sing if you're not going to be willing to enter into that space where you just are open to criticism. Your whole being is in a different place. And not all country music is like that, but there are aspects of it that, to me, illustrate that. And I think it's something that helps people to get access to the idea of that balance between the two aspects of being.
In the Islamic tradition, there's a huge gap between what the Quran says about the equality of men and women and what the reality on the ground exists in many Muslim countries. We can look at the creation story. In the Quran, Adam is mentioned and his wife are mentioned. And the wife is not responsible for the downfall of Adam. It's Satan. It says clearly, Satan misguided Adam and his wife. That is very important. Then they were both banished to earth. They both asked for forgiveness. And God, because God is infinitely compassionate and merciful, God not only forgave the man and the woman, but also, the Quran says, honored them and appointed both of them, male and female, representative of God on earth. And repeatedly, the Quran says, "O believing men, O believing women."
Wow.
But because of patriarchy, because of patriarchal customs, all of this has been abused, particularly in investment in what is called lots of fabricated hadith. Hadith means sayings of the Prophet, which many luxurious sultans and kings, they abuse that to justify their lifestyle. So what I also wanted to say was, in our house of worship, Interfaith Community Sanctuary, we've asked the women, what is it we can do? You tell us. They told us several things. One is, they said, please allow us to express freely our wounds, our anguish, our pain, without fear of retribution. And also let us hear your wounds, this socialized, hearsay-infused patriarchy. So we began that process. Then number two, they've said, please address God. Every tradition says God is genderless. And yes, there is this problem of, no it in the Semitic tradition language. But at least you can address God as often in the feminine pronoun as in the male pronoun. So in our house of worship, we call God not only he, but a lot of times we call, sometimes even more, she. The third thing, and I'll end with that, they say, why can't we deliver sermons during Friday prayers? Why can't we lead prayers? Why is the tradition, so extinct, and yet we follow that tradition because just some scholars in the past, medieval times, has said that is the tradition? Where does it say in the Quran that women can lead with prayers or cannot deliver sermons? So as often as possible in our Friday prayers, small group of women, they deliver sermons and they also lead prayers. So we take action little by little, and that's very important, we feel.
Well, that's huge. Wow. So you've raised a very interesting question. I mean, especially when you talk about the expression of masculine and feminine wounding and being able to talk about that. I would imagine inevitably that touches then on people's shadow sides. And how does that play into it? And a shifting from a patriarchal to more equal engagement. And that's very powerful. And I'd be curious, based also on your response, what Pastor Don and Rabbi Ted have experienced in dancing with this.
Ted, do you want to go ahead or should I go ahead?
Oh.
You can start.
Okay. The Quran says very clearly that the shadow side, the difficult feelings, they come from God. And so spiritual teachers, they feel that this means that all feelings, difficult feelings, are sacred. We have to embrace not only our 10,000 joys and pleasures of life, but also our 10,000 difficult feelings, our shadow side in life. Difficult feelings are simply energies begging our attention. They have an edge only because they are separated from us. They're begging to be acknowledged, to be embraced, to be healed, to be kissed, and then to be integrated. Carl Jung, who studied many Eastern traditions, he would say, can you for once in your life have the courage and the grace to kiss the demons and dragons within you? That's how they turn into a prince or princess. That's why you have Sufi sages, like Rumi, who says the dark thought, the shadow side, the difficult feeling, greet them at the door laughing, because each one has been sent as a guide from beyond. So in the Sufi tradition, which is the spiritual side of Islam, it is a wonderful practice to embrace not only your joys, which is essential, but also your shadow side. That is how you become complete. So there are many techniques. There's something called sacred holding. The difficult feelings, where do you feel it in your body? Embrace it, kiss it, be present with it, integrate it. And of course, all the great traditions say, don't run towards your shadow side, just don't run away from it. That's the key.
Lovely.
In Jewish tradition, a human being is perceived as having two basic inclinations. The Yetzer Tov, the inclination for good, and the Yetzer Hara, literally the evil inclination. And they're usually perceived as the good inclination is seeking the best for everyone, and the evil inclination is seeking the best for ourselves. Namely, how can I get mine no matter what other people have? And versus, how can I make things better here? And the statement is very clear that human beings actually need both. The difficulty comes when we're out of balance, when one becomes so strong. Even when the positive impulse becomes so strong that we stop taking care of ourselves, that we stop having compassion on ourselves, that we stop nourishing ourselves with essentially what we need because we are so focused on the other. The rabbi said, if it wasn't for the Yetzer Hara, the negative inclination, no cities would be built, no buildings would be built, no progress would be made, because in a lot of ways, all that comes out of the desire to express ourselves and to seek better things for ourselves as well as advancements for others. So there's a kind of balance. The shadow is critical, not to be ignored and not to be denied. So that ultimately the message is very similar to what Imam Jamal has expressed within the Sufi tradition. I think one of the things that brings us together is a spiritual sensibility that in some ways not only emerges from each of our traditions, but transcends each of our traditions. We meet at a place. It was, I think, Rumi who talked about meeting in a field beyond right and wrong, meeting in that field beyond the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, however each tradition labels things. There's a kind of transcendence, there's a kind of integration, there's a kind of commonality, there's a kind of deep, deep sharing. In the life we live, in the material world, there is no light without shadow. The fact of shadow tells us that there must be a light somewhere, and the fact of light tells us that there's going to be a shadow somewhere. On this level of being, we know through contrast. If it wasn't for contrast, we wouldn't know anything. We know easy because we know difficult. We know fun because we know not fun. We know joy because we know sadness. We know sweet because we know bitter. If everything went just fine for us, which our ego thinks we'd really like, we wouldn't even know it, because we only know things are going well by its juxtaposition and its contrast to those moments when things are not going so well. So in some ways, the shadow side on this level of reality is inescapable. And as Imam Jamal said so well, the task is to honor it and not deny it, to not pretend that it's not there, to not pretend that each of us has inclinations for self-service rather than for an altruistic service, and to honor that and to know that so that we can speak it and not have that control us. In the world of such remarkable polarization that we live in today, it seems to me that what we're seeing is a radical increase of those who have forgotten that balance between caring for self and caring for other, between caring for my tribe and caring for all of our tribes, between caring for my economic group and caring for all economic groups or all racial groups or all religious groups or all countries.
I'll just give a Christian take on what my two colleagues have said. I think it's no coincidence that the Christian liturgical year begins with what's called Advent, or the coming. We're in it right now. It's the 4 Sundays prior to Christmas. And in a way, I think Advent begins in darkness. Advent names the reality of our darkness or our shadow side, and at the same time hopes to move toward the light. And I think this is a reality that is lost on many people. I mean, it's easy to forget when Christmas is coming that we need to step down into these realities of shadow side and darkness, name them, because naming them is the first step, I would say, toward healing. And naming the fact that we need the light. And that's what Christmas represents. It doesn't mean that Christianity has an angle on this. This is the Christian way of doing this thing we're all talking about. And yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say about that. It's too many. I mean, well, the other thing I want to say is that the Christian church historically has often used fear and darkness to be manipulative, to promote guilt, to control, and so forth. And I think the movement from fear to compassion is an enormously important step for humanity. To name the truth of darkness, to have compassion for it, to even give thanks, as my colleagues have suggested, because it means we have seen that there is a way toward the light. And that's my report.
And he's sticking with it.
So those are some very, very wise words and much to ponder. And I wonder, especially in today's world where there is so much pain, where there was so much turmoil and chaos, what do you suggest for people? I mean, that sounds like such a trite question, but I mean, part of what I hear you talking about is being able to embrace that pain and, if you will, relax into it. But I'm sure there's much more. So what are your thoughts?
I think all of us would agree that it is the belief in separation, or the action as if we are separate groups, separate individuals. The lack of an awareness of our interconnectedness that supports the radical inequalities, whether those inequalities be between men and women, rich and poor, the different races, the different countries, the different religions. And until that consciousness of separation is transcended, there is very little hope for making significant changes in a world of such deep polarization. The one thing that appears constant in human history is war. You know, there were a historian a couple years ago who made a statement that he could only find 200 years in all of recorded human history where there were no wars. And sure enough, another week or two, other historians came forward to say that he was incorrect. There was no time in recorded history where there were no wars. Now, what's critical to remember, particularly in the way the news cycles are in our day, that what doesn't get reported are all the wonderful, loving, compassionate actions and experiences that human beings are having all the time. And the same thing is true of looking at history. There's been no time in history where there haven't been great acts of love and great acts of compassion and great acts of support and great acts of supporting equality and dignity among people and between people. And a consciousness is required to start owning that. We just get so focused on the negative. You know, it's like, look how many people got injured today, rather than look how many people got healed today. Look how many people were healthy today. It's like, look how many divorces there were today. Look how many marriages there were. Look how many families are gathered around a dinner table. You know, it's like, how do we balance in consciousness that the negatives with which we are consistently and constantly bombarded with what often appears as the hidden positives, loving, compassionate actions and experiences of our shared life. And it doesn't make news, but it makes us human. We once said at the beginning of our work together, we've been working together for several years, and we just couldn't get any traction, you know, in terms of we wanted to teach. And we realized that we were too peaceful for press. So we decided that what really would help us is if Imam Jamal and I got into a public fight, the Interfaith Amigos would split up, and then we could have a reconciliation. And that might hit the news cycle and propel us to gain the kind of attention which would allow us to have this conversation with you at this time. So it took us a little longer because we never staged the fight, but that's our lives.
You know, Brother Ted, you have mentioned wars very rightly. The truth really is, if we took care of the wars raging inside of us, there would be no seeds of war outside of us.
Yeah.
So really, it is about spiritual practices. Doesn't matter what your religion is. I remember the story of Mahatma Gandhi when he dared to buy a first-class ticket and sit with the white passengers in an era of apartheid. He was, of course, you know, physically ejected, and he was physically hurt, actually, as he fell onto the platform. It was late at night, and he was thinking of revenge and anger and how he would hit back. But he had another voice saying, there has to be a better way. And he did spiritual practices. And after some time, I don't know, after a few months, he gathered his people around him and he said, I want to make a boast. He says, I know it's not good to boast, but I really want to say this, that after doing the spiritual practices, I've come to the stage in my life, in my consciousness, where no matter how oppressive, how cruel the perpetrator is, the oppressor is, I no longer have that edge of wanting revenge, of extreme anger. I feel angry, but I don't feel furious. I'm able to engage in righteous action. I don't feel hate anymore. And like Rumi, you know, he would say, listen, my friends, he was excited about it. This is in your power. You can do that. But it requires that inner work combined with, you know, or simultaneously with the righteous action we do. So from a wise, deepened being will emerge wise and deepened action. We have to combine the two. Brother Don.
Well, I think my colleagues have said it. I mean, our third book is about the need for spiritual practices to help sustain personal, social, and environmental activism. But it's also to help us to find the center, our spiritual and personal centers that permit us to deal the best with the reality of shadow and the hope for the light. The problem is that spiritual practices require a certain amount of discipline, which can be eclipsed, I think, by enthusiasm, by the way. I mean, you don't have to say, I should do this. I think if you do them, it becomes, I want to do this. It enriches my life. It makes my days better and so forth. I mean, spiritual practices such as prayer, meditation, and fasting, there are all kinds of spiritual practices. Those are among the main ones. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it needs to be habitual. And with that, I think what we find is what my colleagues have said. There's a change in, almost a transformation in the way we perceive experience and the way we perceive ourselves and other people. And that's desperately needed right now.
So you three are incredibly unique individuals in how you perceive and how you work and how you embrace human beings and one another. If people were looking to turn to the Abrahamic religions for support and guidance through working through the shadow sides or their more painful areas, how do you all have an ongoing community that the three of you work together, that people could come and speak with you specifically from your perspectives, because they're just such incredibly unique and special perspectives?
Before that, I'd like to say that in each of our traditions, in each of our holy books, we always tell our community and communities that there are two kinds of verses: particular verses and universal verses. Particular verses are in desperate need of historical and textual context. Universal verses are timeless, placeless, and filled with wisdom. We tell our community and communities that the danger is when you take a particular verse and advocate that as a universal verse. That is a huge problem. So we do discuss among ourselves and between ourselves and others, the way we interpret scripture. That's very important. That's just one aspect.
I think go ahead.
I was just going to say, in terms of connecting personally with us, we do many presentations all over the country every year. And when I lived in Seattle, I could be one of the people would talk to, but I live in Minneapolis now. But Jamal, of course, has the Interfaith Community Sanctuary in Seattle. And Ted is very active at Unity of Linwood, where he is a kind of a theologian and spiritual resource for their programs at Interfaith and so forth. And those are good places to go to speak with them. You can read our books, of course. We have 3. And we like to get questions. I think our second and third books are partly the consequence of questions we got from members of the audiences where we were speaking. So we don't wish to work in a vacuum. We do find it very important to hear what's on the mind of other people and so forth, and appreciate those opportunities when we get them.
And before Ted speaks, I want to say, please consider creating Amigos and Amiga groups and do what we have been doing. We'll be so honored if you do that. Brother Ted.
Amen.
It's a great question. I think individually, certainly Imam Jamal and I are available in our cities, in Seattle. We do programs locally. Most of our local programs, they can't bring Don out from Minneapolis. And we get together on national programs. And frankly, that's the best way for people to interact with the three of us. Right. Because when we get to travel, we not only make public presentations, but we get to sit down with people. And we have smaller conversations over meals or in workshops where we do our best to convey the teaching, as well as where we do our best to learn what are the questions that are needing to be answered, and where, like what's our own next step. We're not done. We experience ourselves in process.
Right on. Well, this is the perfect segue then, I think, for us to open up this conversation a little bit more. And while we invite everybody who is on the call to come onto video screen, which Sandy's going to do for us, I am hoping too that people will continue to work and speak with us, and also on our Reaction to Response Facebook page, there's an opportunity for people to have conversations about these topics as well. Hold on, I see. So for those of you who are joining us now, you are joined and your microphone is muted automatically. If you want to be on the call and not seeing on the, excuse me, on the lower left-hand corner of your screen, there's a stop video. You can go ahead and press stop video if you don't want to be visual to all of us, though it is lovely to see your faces. And we just invite you to have questions. And also, you'll see on the upper right-hand side of your screen, there's an opportunity to move it from speaker view. You'll see to put it, so I think as Sandy likes to regularly say, it's the Brady Bunch style. Okay, hold on, and I will turn this on. Invite you all to speak. Anybody have any questions? And we will, please try and be concise with your questions.
Well, this is Sandy, and once again, on behalf of the Charter for Compassion International, Charter for Compassion in the Women and Girls sector, I wanted to just thank you all so much for such an invigorating and thoughtful and careful conversation. I've seen the three of you many times over the years, and you never disappoint. I am a little my heart's fluttering right now because you speak such truth to power. There is one thing I'm really interested to know that I don't think I know, and that is how you three actually came together. I know it happened after the events of 9/11, but really, what did that moment look like where the three of you realized you had something here and that you needed to take it on the road, if you will? And by the way, I heard that challenge very clearly, that you would like to see this proliferated around the world. And so that grand challenge to create these sacred collaborations of Amigos. You'd love to see Amigos all around the world. So would you share with us how you got started and maybe any advice that you would have for others?
I kind of knew both Imam Jamal and Pastor Don. Pastor Don and I were in a Jewish-Christian dialogue group in Seattle. We've always been interested in interfaith conversation and pursuits. And before 9/11, interfaith was Jewish-Christian. It was only after 9/11 that Islam really came into that picture visibly. Jamal and I knew each other because we were on the board of a group that was attempting to start a spiritual university. He was the identified spiritual imam in Seattle, and I was the identified spiritual rabbi. The university never happened, but when 9/11 happened, when that horror unfolded, the first person I called was Jamal. And I invited him to the Shabbat service that Friday at my congregation because I felt people had to see a different face of Islam. And although I'd never heard him speak, I knew that he represented a face of Islam that was very different from what the media was just blasting at us. And that was the first time we worked together, and we enjoyed. It was great, and we decided to continue, and we kind of started doing various interfaith programs in the Seattle area.
Yeah, and we became good friends, not just the two of us, but our families, our congregations. And we realized, especially after Don came, that this was the key to really connect on a human level. As we said, share 3 cups of tea. So after we became friends, we realized our third cousin was missing. We come from the same Abrahamic family. And of course, as we always joke, a very, very, very dysfunctional Abrahamic family. And then that's where Don comes in, and we started doing programs together. We became good friends. And then I began to realize, I always say jokingly, I began to realize that Rabbi Ted and Pastor Don were 2 of the best Muslims I know. And that really comes through friendship again. So again, the key is connecting on a human level, simple but not easy. The Quran has a wonderful verse, in a tongue-in-cheek verse. It says, well, first of all, it says, that's why we created diversity, so you might come to know one another. It also has another verse which says, and we have created some of you to be a trial for others, meant to be difficult, but essential.
And he tends to look at me when he says that.
That's how Brother Don came in, when he realized we need our third cousin in the Abrahamic family.
Well, as Rabbi Ted said, we knew each other from the Jewish-Christian Dialogue. I had seen a photograph in Yes magazine, and I figured if Yes magazine likes him, I'm going to like him. Ted called me in April of 2002 to say that he and Jamal and some others were planning an event to mark the first anniversary of 9/11, and would I like to be a part of it, and could it be at my church, which was the real reason he called.
No, that's not entirely fair.
No. Well, he called because we're friends too, but it was quite an experience. And as we were debriefing, the 3 of us said, we can't stop now. I mean, we had this intuition, as I said before, that if we could penetrate the barriers that have separated our traditions, we might find ways to cooperate and address the moral issues we're working on. So we started, as they've said, we started doing programs. We started meeting weekly, and we have been meeting weekly for over 16 years. It was in person for a long time, and now it's on Zoom because I live in Minneapolis. Ted's often not in Seattle. He's in Whidbey Island. But we continue to keep in touch and probe each other in these issues. We've been to the Middle East twice. We've been to Japan several times. We've been all over the United States. We've written 3 books, and we're thinking about a 4th one. And we pause often to give thanks for our vocation and ask for the resources to continue it. I think it's important to say 2 things. One is that as religious leaders, there has historically been no piece of a position description that says you should spend some time on interfaith dialogue. So we had to do this on our days off and so forth. But perhaps equally important, it's important for non-religious leaders to be doing this, right. As the Women in the Faith Club did, which I think is so inspiring that they didn't see this as something that they needed to do to maintain a public thing. They wanted to know more about each other. And I'm so grateful that they took the time to write this book they have, The Faith Club. Well, I think that's what I need to say about that.
Well, I want to thank you so much as an interfaith activist of a women's interfaith group. I appreciate that. And I can say about the Faith Club, unfortunately, they disband as a group. They didn't take their initiative any further than that book, but that book does pack a punch.
It does.
You can excuse the expression. It is a powerful book. So perhaps we can, Lisa, we can add that to the recording, email that goes out so everybody has access to that book. It's a real great book. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that beautiful explanation. And I am inspired. And also we'll share this video with the United Religions Initiative.
Yes,
They are grassroots interfaith groups all around the world.
Absolutely. That's something else people can do, create cooperation circles. We write about that. It's a lovely, lovely organization, and cooperation circles are a wonderful way of people of different religions to come together and really focus on social justice issues and earth care.
Exactly.
Could I say something?
Please.
Okay. Thank you so much. I've heard for years and years and years, light workers, armies, and let's do this. Let's change the mental health care, so to speak, on the planet by unity. And I keep hearing the churches unite, they'll stop the fights. And it's about love, loving one another, and growing in our evolution. And right now, we're losing heart and soul daily. It's being drugged out, poisoned out, bombed out, scared out, feared out. It's really intense. And so Rabbi Lerner was on my show. You might know Spiritual Progressives. I'm not sure if you do, but you might want to go, the other rabbi there, get with spiritualprogressives.org. They're on the move. Tikkun, Tikkun, that's Rabbi Lerner.
Tikkun.
Right, yeah, Tikkun. And then also, too, we've got Gabriel Chavez. She's absolutely amazing. And then Deepak Chopra actually...
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute because you're listing fabulous resources, but we do have a limited time. Do you have a specific question or comment?
Yeah, that Heart and Soul Community Services with single payer instead of any more armed force services with single payer or militarized police. We've been there, done it, and we have internet and cell phones to go to Heart and Soul. We have the information to go to Heart and Soul Community Services now with single payer and a basic guaranteed income to free people up. Thank you. Legislation now.
No, you're awesome. Thank you. So as I understand Lynn and know part of what she is.
Yes. We thank her for her passionate involvement.
Yes, exactly.
Wonderful suggestions. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there a way, working, well, you sort of touched on this, but, do you see more and more of the interfaith communities further developing outside of the U.S., for example?
Oh, yes. For a long time, actually, Taiwan was considered a very interfaith center. Turkey was very involved in interfaith. Dubai, is considered a very strong interfaith center. I would say after 9/11, there has been a great consciousness of the need for this interfaith work. Like we say, the interfaith work is not just a question of hospitality, and it's nice and important. It's a matter of our survival. I think this is worldwide that's happening.
Yeah.
I'm going to post here in the chat window the URI's website, and you can see where they are. I think they're in over 50 countries around the world. A lot of work happening in Asia and Africa, largely United States, of course, and then Southeast Asia and the Pacific are really, really active in interfaith collaborations at the grassroots level, which is the most important according to the URI. And my opinion is where the real work happens and world change happens. So yeah, I'm going to put that right.
Sorry, the Unitarian Universalists, they have a United Nations in Washington, D.C. They will help get the legislation on the move. And if the churches unite with the spiritual groups, with the caring activist groups, we can flip this planet quickly into the light and love, joy, green, a whole new plethora of jobs and programs.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
There was a question from earlier, which was, how has Imam Jamal's integration of women and focus on the true inclusive teachings of the Prophet impact been felt outside of your community, and have you had any pushback?
Oh, yeah, we've had a lot of pushback. This is happening not only in our community, in different parts of the United States. There's pushback, but as you know, little by little, the patriarchal biases that men have are slowly eroding. And that's really showing up in more and more women being involved in the social justice issues, in political movements. So for example, in Saudi Arabia, we don't hear about women, but really at the grassroots level, they're very, very heavily involved. This driving ban was really overturned by the moral courage of women going out and driving even though they're being arrested. In Iran, all those movements for democracy are all being led by women. So this is happening globally. In India, the feminist women's organizations are probably the strongest feminist organizations. In Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan even, more is happening than we know.
I have a question, if I may jump in.
Please.
Just to build on what Imam Jamal was talking about. I've had the pleasure the last 3 days of participating in the Forum for Peace in Muslim Societies, which is a really expansive conference with individuals from every continent, with the exception of probably Antarctica. And a couple of things that were pretty consistent, of course, with one is extremists and the radicalization and how that is going to continue to grow. And those comments came from several panelists, mainly experts coming out of the UK, and how to combat it. And also, well, that's one of the central parts. And what you're speaking to in terms of the integration of women. One thing that I felt that really needed to be included was you can't talk about, extremism or lack of or minimizing radicalization unless you start incorporating women into this peace conversation, and educating women who teach their children, who will really make the shift in our societies. And so how can we start integrating those conversations with the pushback that you're getting, and how severe was it for you? And how can we move forward where we're taking this from your community to a broader community and scaling what you're doing?
For us, I think it's very important that we allow women to speak and to lead. We have never allowed them to lead. So for example, women in mosques are speaking up, saying that you allow us to vote, but you don't allow us to stand for the highest positions, for whatever reasons you give. And the reasons they give really is rooted in patriarchy. So women protesting, taking a stand, and getting support from some men who will really support them, that is a very big step. It's little by little, but it's having a big effect. But the main thing is we are speaking about it. We're bringing it out into the open. Women are becoming more educated. They are really saying we have to become empowered through education. Women are becoming not only just educated because they're insisting on it, they're also becoming scholars of the Quran in the Islamic societies. And when women interpret a verse, sometimes it can be 180 degrees different from the male interpretation. And that is making another huge difference.
Can you expound on what you were talking about earlier when you mentioned that some of the hadiths have corrupted, or those interpretations have gone to a very strong bias in the patriarchal realm, that the original context and understanding has been lost?
Well, a very famous one is that verse in the Quran about if you suspect a woman of infidelity, you separate yourself and then you strike her or beat her. The word is daraba. The word daraba is interpreted in many, many ways. One is strike and beat, which men, not all, but most men interpret that as. It also means turn away from. Turn away from and have consensual sex if there is intimate relationships. So that interpretation, who is giving that interpretation? Men give it one way, women give it another way. And there are those who say, well, it is a moderate verse because in those days, 7th century, if women were suspected of infidelity, you would actually kill them. In this case, you just strike them, but also in a very limited way, as some said, use a small twig and symbolically do that. But again, it boils down to who is the one doing the interpretation. And women translating the Quran is having a deep impact. It's very little right now, but it's slowly growing. And that has a remarkable, significant, some cases phenomenal impact.
Thank you.
Anybody? We have a number of other people here who we'd love to hear from you if you have any curiosities or questions who have not yet spoken up. You don't have to be shy.
Well, while they're waiting, Imam Jamal, how did you become in charge of an interfaith congregation? That's
It's a long story. I come from a background of parents and grandparents who have been very devout Muslims, being trained in very conservative schools, but also being trained by the mystics. So we've always had this strain and a lineage of what is called Sufism.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always wanted to become a Sufi community teacher, creating a community, but there was it was a road less traveled. But circumstances forced me, after the death of my parents, who died in the space of 20 days, that I had the courage and the passion to just plunge into what I wanted to do. And through prayers and through help of community friends, we've been able to create this unique community called Interfaith Community Sanctuary.
Wow, that's exquisite. Well, so we have about 3 minutes left. And hold on one second, because we still have some other questions from before. And so since we don't have any live ones right now, there's so much fear, I'm assuming, in the world. Okay, so it looks like this looks like it's more targeted towards Pastor Don, but maybe this is an inclusive one. Let's see. So much fear, and how do you share your vision of moving from fear-based Christianity to more compassionate Christian community to the larger Christian family?
Oh, wow.
Well, you have 2 minutes to answer.
Well, what we teach, what we say when we're making a presentation, we each identify what we call the core teaching of each of our traditions: oneness in Judaism, unconditional love in Christianity, and compassion in Islam. And as I speak, unconditional love, which flows off the tongue without the traction that it needs. I mean, if you think about loving someone without conditions, I mean, that's the basis of forgiveness. That's the basis of reconciliation that contributes to justice and so forth, cooperation. I think that what we try to help people understand is just the importance of the love that is part of Jesus' message, but it is also part of all of our messages. And encourage people to look into spiritual practices and to think about aspects, when they're Christians, think about the story of the prodigal son, where forgiveness is such an important aspect, and the Good Samaritan, where compassion is so important. And to try to find ways to make those real in our lives. 2 minutes.
That was pretty good. You actually have a minute left. The unconditional love piece is I think a challenge. You speak of that. I like how you say it gets stuck on the tongue, or not stuck enough on the tongue.
I would like to say a quick word.
Please.
Again, about language. In Hebrew, the word for compassion is rachamim. Rachamim comes from a root rechem, which means womb. And it identifies compassion as a feminine energy that is uniquely able to hold that which needs to be held when it needs to be held, but support its flight and its own integrity and its own coming into being when it's ready to do that. And it's actually a very feminine energy. And it's not just the province of women, but it's interesting that at the heart, it just makes sense to me that this particular group, women and girls focusing on compassion, is extremely traditional in the coming from Hebrew tradition, Hebrew language. And we need more of it.
Thank you, Rabbi. I just have to say, we often refer to ourselves as the womb of the Charter for Compassion.
Yeah.
Yes.
So exactly. Thank you so much for what a beautiful way of ending this call.
Yes,
I don't like
exactly.
the word ending. I think I've just begun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
It's
you.
really our pleasure.
Yes, an honor.
Thank you so very much.
So we will be sending out a recording of this call, as well as links to your 3 books, and also the reference to 2 things. One, the Faith Club, and then a little bit more about Women on the Move information, and to our 3 guests. If there's anything else that you think should be included in the email sent out to all of our viewers, please let me know.
And the URI, for sure.
Oh, URI, yeah. I think, yes.
Right. That, and also there's a documentary I popped in the chat window, Parade the Devil Back to Hell, demonstrating the power women have at a legislative level, literally.
Great.
Yeah, pretty powerful film, documentary by Abigail Disney. Really beautiful film.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa, for hosting another great call. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Before we go, we will have our unexpected second call this month. We'll be on this coming Friday, the 15th of December, and it will be at 11 a.m. And as always, if you cannot join us at that time, please do register anyway, and you will get a copy of the recording. Thank you to our fabulous Interfaith Amigos. You have been a blessing to us. And thank you. And may we have a wonderful holiday and much goodness to all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Sandy. God bless. Thank you.
God bless. Happy
God bless
holidays.
you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.